Hello and welcome to the podcast of moralapologetics.com. I'm your host, Jonathan Pruitt. As always, our aim is to get you thinking about the moral argument because it has the ability to both illuminate the mind and stir the heart. One quick reminder, the entries for the writing contest are due March 1st. You can find the details for the contest by clicking the banner at the top of moralapologetics.com. Okay, this week we'll be hearing a lecture from Dr. David Baggett. Those of you who have been listening to the podcast for a while likely know Dr. Baggett already. But for those of you who don't, you should know that Dr. Baggett is professor of apologetics at Liberty Baptist Theological Seminary. Before that, he taught philosophy for many years at the undergraduate level. Dr. Baggett also co-wrote, along with Jerry Walls, Good God, Christianity Today's Apologetic Book of the Year for 2012. He's also working on a new book, God and Cosmos, Moral Truth and Human Meaning, again with Dr. Jerry Walls. The title of this lecture is 4 Ways God Best Explains Morality. Just a quick note on the audio, there was no microphone for audience questions, so all the audio comes through Dr. Baggett's microphone. I've tried to amplify and clean up the audience questions, but if it's still unclear, I apologize for that. Nevertheless, this is an insightful lecture and well worth your time. Now let's get straight over to Dr. Baggett's lecture.
Our hearts and into our deep-seated convictions that some things are really right, some things are really wrong, some things are really good, and some things bad. Even atheists can recognize this, and in fact, they'll be the first ones often to tell you, look, I don't need God to tell me what's right and wrong, I can see this for myself. And that's actually a great starting point, because now we can ask, okay, well, what best explains these facts that we are agreed upon, right? I'm not looking forward to the day when atheists say, yeah, I agree with you. Naturalism and morality are at odds, so I'm going to give up my morality, keep my naturalism. Not looking forward to that day. I suspect that we're going to see more and more atheists and secularists kind of moving in that direction, but I'm not looking forward to it. So the way things stand, it seems to me, the moral argument has a great deal of potential. The moral argument can come in different varieties. The way we're going to do it tonight is really by putting about 4 different approaches together into one cumulative approach. There's a handout. If you just came in and didn't get it, you can get it. There's some right here. Anybody coming in late, there's a handout. So here we go. What we're going to do is contrast these two worldviews, the theistic worldview on the one hand, generally, the Christian worldview more specifically, and we will be bringing to bear certain specific concrete points of theology from Christianity into our argument tonight. We're not just going to be talking about generic theism, but we'll start there and contrast theism with naturalism. So theism, of course, is this idea that God exists. There is this omnibenevolent, omniscient, omnipotent being and so forth who created the world and all that there is, including you and me, and he created us for a reason, for a purpose, and all of that. We're going to contrast that kind of worldview with a naturalistic worldview according to which the ultimate realities that there are space and time and matter and energy, but there is no heaven, no hell, no Satan, no demons, no God, and so forth, okay? And we're going to say now, in light of certain moral dimensions that are in need of explanation, which of these two worldviews better explain, right, what is in need of explaining? Here's a handout for you, sir. So those are the two rival worldviews. And again, the argument is going to be couched in terms of explanatory superiority. So the question that we want to ask here about the Christian worldview is, do we have good reasons to believe that it is true, that it is beautiful, and that it has explanatory power, and particularly greater explanatory power than does naturalism? I really want to encourage Christians to think in terms of the Christian worldview. Do you have a handout? Okay. The Christian worldview in terms of more than just a list of your beliefs. If someone says, what is your worldview as a Christian? Go beyond merely saying, well, I believe X, Y, and Z, or A, B, and C, and say, this is what I believe, and this is why I believe it, and these are the reasons why I believe it to be true. And its ability, the Christian worldview's ability to explain important facts, to explain important phenomena, is one of the best reasons to believe that the Christian worldview is true. And among the important phenomena in need of explanation is morality. It has a lot of features distinctive to it that I think our naturalistic friends are rather hard-pressed to explain by their worldview, and that we can explain much more effectively. All right. So the four moral dimensions that we'll be considering tonight are these. We're going to begin with moral facts. Then we're going to talk about moral knowledge. And then we're going to talk about moral transformation. And finally, we're going to talk about an issue that pertains to this, the convergence of virtue and happiness. Do we have principled reasons to believe that these things at the end of the day come together? Or could you be virtuous and unhappy, or happy and unvirtuous, right? That sort of possibility. We're going to talk about that. So those are the four dimensions of morality in need of explanation, and in each case we're going to argue that theism provides the better explanation. And I'm going to do my best to save as much time at the end for questions and discussion. Okay? I don't want to just talk to you the whole time. All right. Now, moral facts. I'm going to talk about four of these. We're going to begin with moral values, then we're going to talk about moral duties or obligations, then we're going to talk about moral freedom, and then a constellation of issues pertaining to the human condition, human dignity, human equality, and human rights. All right? So let's begin with moral values. Moral values. Moral values pertain to that which is of worth, that which is of value, that which is good, and specifically that which is morally good. And so the question to pose our naturalistic friends is, what do you have to say by way of providing an account of or an explanation for moral values? Moral values. And it seems to me that given the resources at their disposal as naturalists, they can say a fair bit about things that are of instrumental value, but they're going to be much more hard-pressed to explain intrinsic values. Intrinsic values. So what is this distinction between instrumental value and intrinsic value? Something is of instrumental value if it's not so much valuable, say, in and of itself, but it's a value in getting something else that you might value, so like money. Right? It doesn't have intrinsic value, but it has this sort of instrumental value where you can exchange it for other things that you might want, right? Well, naturalists can explain instrumental values, I don't think with much difficulty. But what about intrinsic values, right? Take even something like friendship. What makes it something of intrinsic value, valuable in and of itself for the naturalist in light of the way the naturalists sort of see the world as a complex collocations of atoms and molecules and such, right? This is a hard question for our naturalistic friends to answer. Now, don't get me wrong on this. I don't think our naturalistic friends have any difficulty at all recognizing intrinsic values, like friendship, right? Because they're human beings, and they've been created in God's image, and for a reason and for a purpose and all of that. And they have the capacity to recognize that there's something intrinsically valuable, say, in friendship, right? Or loving relationships, right? But the question is, what better explains here? What better explains the intrinsic value of something like loving relationships or something like friendships? Naturalism, on the one hand, that says ultimately all that there is atoms and molecules and such, including you and me, right? Or a rich, robust, theistic worldview according to which there is a loving creator who made us in his image and for the purpose of loving relationships and the like. Okay? So they can recognize that there are these things, but in terms of providing an account of these inherent values, intrinsic values, given the limited resources at their disposal as naturalists, that's their challenge. Okay? And I don't think that theists face the same challenge here at all. But here is a contemporary example of a naturalist, someone who doesn't believe in God, right? And who is a very smart person. This person happens to be a philosopher. Her name is Philippa Foot. And she attempts to provide an account of what intrinsic values are all about. And she tries to provide a naturalistic account of intrinsic values, intrinsic goods and such. And she's written a book called Natural Goodness. And in a nutshell, her attempt goes something like this. Well, look, human beings are supposed to have 32 teeth. This is how we evolved. And lions, well, they're supposed to run. And rabbits, they're supposed to jump. You know, these are species-specific traits that these various, animals and the like ought to exhibit, ought to manifest, right? We ought to have these things. These things are good for us. As human beings, we ought to have 32 teeth and so forth. Well, moreover, something like having friendships is also something that's good for us, because as human beings, this is how we flourish and the like, all right? And every species has certain behaviors, certain traits of character and such, which if they cultivate will lead to a more, fulfilling kind of life. And this goes for human beings. And this is where morality comes from, you see. So why is something like friendship valuable? Why is it morally good? Well, because this is just the way we are as species, right? We know enough about the human condition to say that when we have friendships, our lives are better. We flourish and the like, okay? So she attempts to provide a thoroughgoing naturalistic explanation of intrinsic value. Now, that doesn't work, though. Can anyone tell me why? Can you tell me why? And by the way, you can interrupt me at any time. I teach, so I'm used to having discussion. I don't just like to do all the talking. And you can interrupt at any time if you have any questions or comments or anything. But why doesn't this work? Yeah.
Unlike the animals, we as humans have to make a lot of decisions about how we're going with it. The animals, rabbits in this state, in Maryland, are a lot like the rabbits in Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
But even people who live in houses next to each other can live very different lives.
They can. And she does want to draw some distinctions between the animals and us, but she also wants to draw out these similarities. And she wants to say, she calls these natural normativities, in these animals, like the jumping of the rabbits and so forth, or the reproduction patterns of the rabbits. These are their natural normativities, species specific, right? But with respect to human beings, right, when these have implications for our survival and for our flourishing and whatnot, now something new comes into being, which is morality. And she is attempting to provide this purely natural understanding of morality. So she would admit there are some differences here, important differences between the animals and us, but I think there's a more fundamental problem. There's a more fundamental problem that she's leaving unaddressed. Yeah.
What makes human flourishing intrinsically good?
What makes human flourishing intrinsically good? Right. Now that's something I think that we would all agree it is intrinsically good. And I think that she as an atheist can recognize that it's intrinsically good, right? But again, the question is, can she provide an explanation for why it's intrinsically good based upon her worldview alone? Right? Now here's the deal. With respect to mosquitoes, with respect to tigers and lions and cancer cells, she would say in each one of those cases, they have their natural normativities that lend themselves to flourishing, those things flourishing, right? But that doesn't entail or imply anything about the intrinsic value of those things' survival. She admits this. But if it doesn't have any implications about intrinsic value when it comes to those things surviving, why is it different for human beings? You see this? In other words, on her worldview, she hasn't given us any reason to believe, as he said, that our flourishing has intrinsic value. And again, I think she recognizes that it does have intrinsic value. We can all recognize that, theists and atheists alike, right? But she can't explain it very well. She can try to explain it to some degree, but we have the better explanation, you see, as theists and as Christians. Why do we have intrinsic value? Because we were made in God's image. God loves us. God has a plan for us, right? He created us for a purpose. We are eternal beings. We're not just accidents. We're not just collocations of molecules. Do you see? This is a very important worldview difference, yeah.
At some point, explanations are going to demand meta-narratives that move you from physical to metaphysical.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it doesn't seem to me that she's going to be able to generate the resources to tell a big enough story. She's sort of confined to the myopic resources of her worldview, And she kind of straitjackets herself in that way, and as a result can't really break out of it enough to give an overarching reason to really take this seriously. Again, she can recognize that we have intrinsic value, but she can't explain it. This is, it seems to me, one of the important things that we have to point out in the moral argument, that our naturalistic friends are hard-pressed to provide an explanation for something so important as intrinsic human value. Intrinsic human value. Yes, sir?
Why would most naturalists even believe in intrinsic value when, naturalism is supposed to be the survival of the fittest?
Right.
Of our species would be more way to go.
Yeah. Well, because then if they want to say the advancement of the species is something that we ought to promote, well, why is that? Because the promotion of our species has intrinsic value. Well, why is that? Because we have intrinsic value. You see, they're going to be hard, it's going to be hard for them to kind of get away from that altogether. And moreover, most of them are still at that place where they want to say, but I believe that torturing children for the fun of it really is wrong. And most of them still want to remain moral objectivists. Most of them, I think, are far better than their worldview in that way. I had a debate with John Shook last year in Buffalo, and this is what I said to him at one time. I said, John, I think that you're a really good guy in a lot of ways. I mean, it's very clear and evident and obvious, that you take seriously feeding the poor and reaching out to the marginalized and the oppressed and the dispossessed and so forth and so on. I think that's all great. But I think you're far better in this sense than your worldview, because I don't think that your worldview can really sustain those convictions in any kind of really principled way, So we're not criticizing the people here at all. At all. Quite to the contrary, we're usually saying, you're absolutely right about so much, but we've got the better explanation. The better explanation, you see, for those very convictions that you yourself would have, especially if they claim to be humanists, for crying out loud. And by the way, there's a rich tradition of humanism within Christianity, and don't forget that. Flannery O'Connor and Erasmus and so, yeah, go ahead.
Why couldn't you just bite the bullet and say, you're right, there is no intrinsic value, it's just instrumental value. That's sufficient to establish morality.
Yeah. It's an interesting question, especially because you're asking a question about Philippa Foot, who years ago wrote a paper called "Can Morality Be Entirely Constructed of Hypothetical Imperatives?" She's actually come to reject that view because she sees it as inadequate. She thinks that morality does require something more than that, something more substantive, an affirmation of intrinsic values, and more than just instrumental goods. There have to be intrinsic goods. Without that, she thinks morality can't get off the ground. She actually is the one who is best known for that very position that you just identified, but herself came to reject it in years to come, and rejected vociferously. She herself thinks, no, it's just a dead end. You've got various, regress problems and so forth. We were doing this for this other purpose and that for this other purpose, but it's got to have a starting point or a stopping point, depending on which way you're looking at it. Things like that, Some ground level axiomatic moral truths on which to base the whole system. Yeah. Well, okay, good. Now, what about theism? The foundation for our moral worth as theists and as Christians, of course, is God himself, who functions at the basis and foundation of reality. I've got a quote there from Robert Adams. You can read it for yourself. But in his book, Finite and Infinite Goods, he makes this case quite effectively, quite persuasively, that we've got excellent reasons to believe that at the foundation of reality, the ultimate good is God himself. God himself. God in his character. God in his nature and such. So let's pause just for a moment to flesh this out a little bit more distinctively Christianly and talk about God's nature and our convictions about God is at the foundation of value here. Because ultimately, when we talk about the nature of God, as Christians, we're saying something rather more specific. We're actually talking about the Trinity. On a Christian understanding of things, the nature of God cannot be understood apart from understanding that God is three in one. Three in one. And I have a quote here from C.S. Lewis, which is quite appropriate because do you all know what today is? What happened 50 years ago today? He died. Yeah, same day that John F. Kennedy got shot, C.S. Lewis died, an hour before. So 50 years to the day, C.S. Lewis died. We're talking about the moral argument for God's existence. And he was very well known for, among other things, a moral argument for God's existence at the beginning of mere Christianity. So I didn't plan that. That's just a wonderful, fortuitous happenstance. But here's a quote from Lewis about the Trinity you might like. All sorts of people, he said, are fond of repeating the Christian statement that God is love. But they seem not to notice that the words, God is love, have no real meaning unless God contains at least two persons. Love is something that one person has for another person. If God was a single person, then before the world was made, he was not love. So God is one. God is one, right? But God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, three in one. Standard Trinitarian monotheistic view of Christianity here. This is actually a great clue to understand that self-giving love is actually what is at the heart of the very nature of God. And so for us to say that the locus of value is God himself and his nature, what we're saying is that at the foundation of reality is love. Love wasn't something that bubbled to the surface after a long evolutionary process guided by nothing. Love was what started the whole process. At the beginning, there was love right from the start because God was at the beginning and God got it all going. Right? This is a profound insight and a big difference in worldview, right? Between us and our naturalistic friends. Yes. Where exactly did that one come from? Somewhere in Mere Christianity. Quite sure. Quite sure. If anybody knows specifically, you can let us know. But I'm quite sure that's in Mere Christianity. Okay. So, the second moral fact, is moral duties. We've been talking about moral values. Now consider moral duties, right? This strange idea that there are some things that we ought to do. Moral duties come along and say, you know what? You might not want to do this, but you ought to do this. And the idea that these things have a kind of authority over us, a prescriptive power over us. They say, look, you really ought to do this. You know, but I don't want to. It doesn't really matter whether you want to or not. You ought to. We all believe that there are such things on occasion as moral duties. Where would those come from? Where would those come from? Especially on a naturalistic understanding of things. Think about it. Think how strange of an entity this would be, a binding, authoritative, moral obligation and duty in a purely naturalistic world. Where would that come from? Do you get the idea? George Mavrodes wrote a whole article on this topic, of how odd moral duties would be in a purely what he calls Russellian world, after Bertrand Russell, a naturalistic world, in other words, right? Now, our naturalistic friends, it seems to me, can provide potentially an account for why we might feel like we have an obligation. They might even be able to tell an evolutionary story according to which, we have an account for why we have feelings of moral obligation. But what's the problem? What's the problem there? Have they accounted for obligations yet? Well, yeah, potentially. You might have the feeling of an obligation without actually having an obligation, in which case the feeling would be illusory, would be misleading, it would be deceptive. There would be an appearance of an obligation, but not a reality of one. How would you know the difference? Right now, the question is this. What we would agree on, theists and atheists alike, is, okay, well, we have this feeling of an obligation, okay? But then you think about the implications of naturalism and you begin to understand that they can't account for these things, right? So on a naturalistic worldview, all they can do is account for the feeling of an obligation. But on a theistic worldview, a supernaturalistic worldview, according to which God made us and commands us to do certain things and wants us to live in a certain way and wants us to live with the grain of the universe and in accordance with his will and love and so forth, and he wants us to be conformed to the image of Christ and that sort of thing, we have a robust account of what would actually explain real existing obligations, right? So there's a sense in which you can't, right? I mean, either way, well, it's a feeling of an obligation, but how do you account for the actual obligation? There, you have to do more than just look inside of yourself and ask how it feels. You have to ask which worldview is true. Which worldview gives you a principal reason to believe in genuine, actual moral obligations? Theism gives you lots of reasons to think that this is the case. Naturalism, though, does not.
But they wouldn't see it. There even being a need to explain a real obligation. They get to the point of explaining the appearance of an obligation in your job itself.
I don't think so. I don't think that even most of them would agree. I think most of them are going to say, well, look, I realize that I could have a feeling of an obligation without there being an actual moral obligation. But we believe in actual moral obligations. I mean, so explaining the mere feeling of the obligation is not going to be enough. It seems to me, I mean, they have to recognize the possibility of an appearance-reality distinction here, right? That the feeling might be misleading. So most of them want to attempt to provide some deeper account of where obligations come from. But here's the deal. I'm a professional ethicist. This is what I do. For 20 years, I've read these guys. I just can't find a single solitary, compelling, naturalistic explanation of actual moral obligations, right? The best, it seems to me, that they can do is provide an account for the mere feelings of obligations, and that's it. So at the end of the day, if you're a naturalist, you're going to probably be left with reasons to begin to really doubt whether those feelings actually have any corresponding actual obligations, right? So turning it the other way, if someone is genuinely convinced that these things are real, then the question becomes, which worldview better explains them, right? And again, theism is going to win hands down. So far, there are two moral facts that naturalism cannot explain nearly so well as can theism and supernaturalism, moral values and moral duties. When William Lane Craig gives his version of the moral argument, this is what he focuses on. And the way he'll put it is if God doesn't exist, then objective moral values and duties don't exist, right? I'm not actually even going that far myself. All I'm saying is something less ambitious. Theism provides the better explanation. And I think that case can be made quite effectively. Yep.
The feelings could provide evidence
Yep.
of moral obligations.
Yep.
Because why would you feel that a naturalist could feel that a person has intrinsic value?
Yep.
He doesn't have a good reason
Right.
to think that, but he can feel it.
Yep.
And if you point out to him that, why do you feel it? Maybe you feel it because it's real.
Because it's true. That's right. But it's being true is much more consistent with the theism, isn't it? Right. Whereas on the naturalistic picture, you have what epistemologists like to call a defeater for the belief. You know, I had this belief, I had this feeling, but now that I've been told this naturalistic story, I realize those things don't really fit into the story. So now I have a defeater for those things. I had believed in them, and now I've got good reason to give up the beliefs, right? But a theist doesn't have any good reasons to give up their convictions about objective moral truths, objective moral values and duties. We have rather an effective explanation for why those things would actually be real. That's the idea, yeah.
I would have thought the argument for a naturalist, and I haven't read too much literature, but fundamentally the human race, we're not strong like lions, we don't have claws. The only way we could have survived through evolution is by working together.
Yeah.
And the feelings of mutual support would be wired into our brain.
Yes.
We would have never survived.
Right. That's right.
Would that view explain why we feel obligated?
Yes, it would. It would exactly explain, potentially, right, why we feel obligated, why we feel certain things have intrinsic value. Because having those beliefs conduce to reproductive advantage, right? Conduce to our survival, right? That's right. But what those explanations don't provide is any reason to think that those things are actually true. And this is why when we get to the issue of moral knowledge, we'll see that this is the very problem that they face. This is the very problem that they face. Okay. Let me move on to, let me say about moral duties. I'm not gonna dwell on it, but as a theist, there's all kinds of ways theists have attempted to explain why we have moral duties. Some give divine command accounts, some divine will accounts, some divine nature accounts. But what all of these theistic ethicists agree on is that if there are such things as these objective moral duties, somehow or other, they're rooted in God, His will, His nature, His commands, right? What He loves, what He hates, what He is drawn to, and so forth, right? And we have this kind of robust account for why there would be these binding moral obligations. The naturalist doesn't have that kind of story to appeal to. There's a quote from Mackey. I don't have time to read it. Mackey's an atheist who, even as an atheist, noticed that these moral obligations are an odd fit in a purely naturalistic world. By the way, this is why a lot of naturalists are giving up belief in moral obligations, including a lot of naturalistic ethicists. And a lot of them are moving more in the direction of virtue theory because by moving to virtue theory, they don't have to talk about those tricky moral obligations as much anymore because a lot of them are beginning to recognize that they just don't have the worldview resources to make good sense of them. So this is a trend among a lot of contemporary naturalistic ethicists, and I think we can understand why.
Isn't virtue theory pretty much a matter of convention?
Not necessarily. I think it seems to me you could be a theist and a virtue ethicist because you believe that there is an intrinsic value in living a certain way, being conformed to the image of Christ and the like. In general,
That's only part of the ethical equation, though.
yes,
It involves ontology, it involves pragmatism and virtue.
yes.
But naturalistic virtue ethics is primarily a conventional matter. What's best for society, what's best for the individual.
Potentially. I wrote on this very topic at EPS. My paper was on naturalistic virtue theory. Philippa Foot is an example of a naturalistic virtue theorist. She doesn't want to say it's a matter of convention. She wants to say it's about a matter of natural normativities that have these moral implications. They come in different varieties. I'm writing a book on this very topic, taking apart all of these various naturalistic theories and trying to take each one on its own and say, okay, well, this is what it's saying, and then giving an answer and sort of drawing general conclusions at the end, but only after having gone through a slew of these particular theories, So I hesitate to generalize, but much of what you're saying is true. That is right. What I would say is, if you can join the virtue theory with theism and with enough rich ontology and metaphysics and so forth, it can be a part, it seems to me, of the right overall moral theory, though, yeah. I'm not opposed to it in general. Okay, the third fact is the fact of moral freedom. Let me just be quick about it, okay? Now think about it. Think about the naturalistic worldview for a second. According to their worldview, right, you and I are complex collocations of atoms and molecules, right, ultimately? This almost inevitably is going to make us something like complex organic machines. We're just kind of playing out our programming, right? I mean, everything operates according to the causal laws at work in the world, clouds in the sky and so forth, but that goes for me and you too if the naturalists are right? We are complicated organic machines playing out our programming. How are we going to be exempt from the causal laws in the world? Do you see what I'm saying? The very likely scenario is, on a naturalistic understanding of the human condition and of reality, is that we are determined to do everything that we do, right? So when I do that, I really couldn't have done any different. In that circumstance, my brain state being what it was, the laws of the world being what they were, and so on. What this precludes, it seems to me, is genuine moral freedom. Genuine moral ability to do otherwise. Libertarian freedom, you might say. That kind of freedom that when you come to the fork in the road and you got to make a choice, succumb to the temptation or resist the temptation, whatever you end up doing, you had to do in that circumstance. You couldn't have done otherwise unless you had libertarian freedom. Now, many of us as Christians believe that God has conferred that kind of libertarian freedom upon us. By His grace, He's enabled us to make meaningful choices, one way or the other, right? But on a naturalistic picture, it's very unlikely, let me put it like this, it's very unlikely that we have that kind of substantive, robust, libertarian free will if we live in a purely determined world. And this seems to be the likely scenario, at least at the macroscopic level, if our naturalistic friends are right. That's just a fact, it seems to me. I don't know how they get around that one. Moral freedom is awfully hard to come by in a naturalistic world. But without moral freedom, how do you hold people genuinely morally responsible for their choices, right? How is it that there is such a thing as morality if we don't have any genuine moral freedom? Like, we come to the fork in the road, morality says you ought to do B and not A, but whether you do A or B is determined. So what are you going to do? Like, he chose A, should have chosen B. Well, let's hold him blameworthy for the decision. He couldn't have done otherwise in that circumstance. Do you see the problem with that view? It's just devastating to morality. So this is one of those important moral facts, moral freedom, that a naturalist has a notoriously hard time explaining. I don't think we have as nearly hard a time understanding it. Why did God give us meaningful free will? So that we can love Him freely, so that we can love each other freely, so that we're not just complex organic machines. We're not just automatons, right, playing out our programming. Do you see? You had your hand up.
The end of which God is selfish being. It's just talking the whole book about how it's nice to determine the selfishness of going this direction.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the book, human beings alone have the ability to rise above the machine and to escape the determinism with which we evolve.
Right.
What's going around for it is just set forth a wonderful poetic assertion.
He begins to wax poetic at the end there without any principled grounds for saying it, seems to me, whatsoever. This isn't polemical. This isn't like putting words in their mouth. This is just politely, patiently pointing out the unpalatable implications of their worldview. And again, most of them down deep are firm believers that we have libertarian free will. Again, they're better than their worldview. Almost in every case, they're better than their worldview. So hold their feet to the fire. I mean, help them to see that they deserve a better worldview, a worldview that is truer to the human condition. Okay. This is a quote from William James. I'm sorry about that, but that glitch there. But I won't read this whole quote, I guess, just for time's sake. But basically what he's saying is, if we lived in a purely determined world, there would be plenty of actions that would be a perfect mechanical fit in that world. And he gives the story of a man who shoots his wife 4 times in the desert, and then she's still alive, and she says, "You didn't do it on purpose, dear." And he says, "No, I didn't do it on purpose," as he picks up a rock and crushes her skull. And he says, to say the least, this is, though a perfect mechanical fit in a determined world, this action, this hideous action, it's a bad moral fit, quite obviously, right? But think about it. This category of moral regret, we regret that such a thing happened. No other event in that situation had a ghost of a chance of happening. That was bound to happen exactly in that way, exactly at that time, if the naturalists are right, if determinism is right. But intuitively, down deep, we know that moral regrets are legitimate, that there are some things that happen that shouldn't have happened, right? That it makes perfect sense on a theistic worldview that that's the case. On a naturalistic worldview, it doesn't even seem to me that you have any chance of carving out room for the category of moral regret. Okay. And then finally, among the facts, this cluster of conditions related to humanity. Think about human dignity, human equality, human rights. Again, most of our naturalistic friends are firm believers in these things, right? But if you really press them, why do you believe, say, in human dignity? Why is it that we have dignity? I mean, as theists, what's our explanation, right? We were created by an infinite, eternal God in His image, right? Each one of us has infinite, eternal dignity because God's conferred it upon us. What's their explanation for something like human dignity? And this is not a small question. We live in a world in which holocausts have happened because people's dignity has been denied. This is huge. We need an explanation for human dignity. And the naturalists don't really have it. They often recognize that we have such dignity, but again, they can't account for why. We can. What about human equality? I was at Oxford over the summer at a conference, and there was this utilitarian who spoke, and I went up to him afterwards. He was a nice guy, and I said, "Hey, man, so as a utilitarian, you have to believe that all of us are essentially equal, morally equal. Utilitarianism is based upon this concept." But he didn't believe that we're all equal because we were all created in God's image or anything like that. So I said, "So what is your basis for believing it?" And he said, "That's a really hard question. I guess the best I can do is to say," and in all honesty, this is what he said, "I suppose we're all equal because we're all equally unimportant." That's the best he could come up with. That's the best he could come up with. Why do we believe, as Christians say, that we are morally equal? Because God created each and every one of us in His image. And He loves everybody. He made us all morally equal. That's why you can't let some people just fall through the cracks and so forth because they're less valuable or whatever. No. Every human being is of equal and infinite worth because we were made by God, right? Terribly important moral category we can make full sense of. Our naturalist friends are really hard-pressed to. Most of them will be firm believers in human rights. But why believe in human rights? And throughout the history of human civilization, there have been ever so many who have denied them. You have a firm explanation if you believe in something like, we've all been endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, right? But otherwise, our naturalistic friends are simply left to do this. My explanation is, I believe in them. End of story. There's no other account for them. If you're talking about moral rights, now legal rights can be conferred. Governments can do that. But I'm talking about moral rights, right? What in their worldview is going to provide an explanation, a grounding for human rights? You see? They believe in human rights. They see that we have human rights. They apprehend all of that. They're all right about that. But their worldview can't sustain those convictions. Ours can. It's because ours is the true worldview, true to the human condition. It carves out space for all of these moral facts we're trying to explain, you see. All right? So, that's the idea. Now, that's the first part. The second dimension, I'll be quicker about these and then we'll have more discussion, okay? But the second important moral dimension is the one of moral knowledge. I'm going to go back to your point right now. This point that you were saying about evolution. It's exactly right. The best that they can do is this. They tell a naturalistic evolutionary story according to which we formed the moral beliefs that we did because having those beliefs conduced to reproductive advantage. So, what's the explanation for our beliefs? Well, because having those beliefs helped us to get along, helped us to cooperate, helped us to move forward as a species. Great! What was conspicuously absent in that account of the beliefs? Any reference to truth. The truth of the beliefs played no part in the naturalistic story as to why those beliefs formed. They formed because they conduced to reproductive advantage. They had an evolutionary advantage, not because they were true. You see this? A guy named Angus Ritchie has written an entire book on this subject. It's called From Morality to Metaphysics. From Morality to Metaphysics. And that's him there. That's his book. You can hardly tell because of the coloring. But he basically says theism can close this explanatory gap. The naturalists cannot. This explanatory gap between why we have the beliefs and the beliefs actually being true. The theists can close the gap because we believe in a God who created us with the cognitive capacities to apprehend these moral truths and come to form these beliefs because they were true, not because merely they conduce to reproductive advantage. But as long as you're stuck in that mechanistic, deterministic, and evolutionary sort of naturalistic story, right, that kind of teleological account for how we could have formed that knowledge is not going to be forthcoming. So again, moral knowledge becomes a huge Achilles heel on the naturalistic story, whereas on the theistic story, we have an impeccable account. Rooted in God's creation of us, God's creation of the world, God's conferring upon us the requisite cognitive machinery to do this, that closes that explanatory gap, that explains how it is that we can have moral knowledge. This is a huge difference among worldviews here between the naturalists on the one side and the classical, robust theists on the other. This matter of moral knowledge. Let me go back. Darwin himself recognized this challenge, this problem, when he at one point wrote this. He said, "With me the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind?" Darwin himself recognized that the story that he was telling potentially functioned as a powerful defeater for something like knowledge, generally, moral knowledge particularly. He kind of set it aside, but you can't really set this problem aside. This is a huge problem. So this is the second dimension. We started with the moral facts that theism explains better than naturalism. Now moral knowledge, and now two more, and we'll be done and we can discuss stuff. The third one is moral transformation. Moral transformation. Now, I think this is relevant to a moral argument for God's existence because oftentimes when you give a moral argument for God's existence, our atheist friends will say something like this. Well, look, I don't need to believe in God to be a moral person and this kind of thing. And then we always have to stop and we say, look, we're trying to explain moral facts here, moral duties and moral values. We're not saying you're a bad person or anything like that. A lot of them are really good people in a lot of ways, and they care about the poor and so forth and so on. I gotta make it clear that we're not saying anything to the contrary. But it finally dawned on me that after you say that and you get back to the main track and you make your arguments pertaining to various moral facts and how theism provides the better explanation, you should really come back to this issue and say, but since you mentioned it, let's be honest. None of us is very good. None of us as a human being is all that great when it comes to morality. I mean, the version of the moral argument that Lewis gives at the beginning of Mere Christianity, is based upon two things. That we recognize there's a standard and that we recognize that do you guys remember? That we don't meet it. That we always, inevitably, invariably fall short. I mean, if you're just honest with yourself, right? I mean, when you think about the selfishness, I mean, you think about the bad attitudes, right? I mean, all I can do is look inside my own mind, my own heart, and I realize this. But I suspect that this is a story that we could all tell. When we look within ourselves and are very honest with ourselves, we all recognize a deep need for moral change, for moral improvement, for moral transformation, and not just incremental growth and incremental development, though that can play a part in it. I mean, we really need radical transformation. Radical transformation. And it seems to me that the naturalists don't have a whole lot to offer here. They really don't. I mean, the best you can do is just, by sheer dint of effort, kind of grit your teeth, do a little bit better here and there. Maybe you join a little accountability society, and encourage each other to become more moral people. And maybe there can be a little bit of improvement here and there. But at the end of the day, and Immanuel Kant had this recognition, morality demands nothing less than perfection. We continue to fall short, and we recognize that we keep falling short of some standard. We don't know where that standard came from exactly, but we recognize that there's a standard there that we can't meet on our own resources, right? But Christianity comes along and offers the good news after having, delivered that bad news that you're going to fall short. The good news that, with God's help, with God's grace, with God's forgiveness, with God's power, with God's sanctification, you can be transformed and ultimately made whole and ultimately made perfect. We have an account for deep moral transformation, it seems to me, as theists and specifically as Christians, that simply goes far beyond anything that the naturalistic story can provide. Anything. John Hare makes this kind of point. If you're interested in this dimension of the moral argument, read The Moral Gap by John Hare, a great book. And in the book, he makes the case that what our naturalistic friends will tend to do is either, give up or try to maybe subtly reduce the moral standard, in various ways, right? But Christianity doesn't reduce the standard. It instead says, yes, you can't meet that standard. I can't meet that standard on my own strength, on our own strength. But God comes along and gives us additional resources to do those things that we're called to do and we're obligated to do. It's true that ought implies can. Remember, it's true that our naturalistic friends have a real problem with the lack of free will. We saw that before, and how can you be held morally responsible for things you can't do? But there's this additional wrinkle now. There are some things that you might be called to do that you can't do on your own, but you can do with the help and grace of God. Well, that's exactly what Christianity teaches, isn't it? Right? So again, I think this moral transformation dimension of the moral argument is really important. Finally, the fourth dimension of morality has to do with the convergence of virtue and happiness. A guy named Sidgwick, pictured here, once discussed what he called the dualism of the practical reason. The dualism of the practical reason. And it has to do with this. That morality, on the one hand, says, you should do what is in your own best interest, right? I mean, you have a moral duty to yourself in that sense, right? But there are also other times when you really ought morally to do something for someone else, right? And to just kind of forget about yourself. But there are occasions when these things conflict. And when you do that good thing maybe for another person that you feel obligated to do, it's really going to hurt you. And in those moments, what are you going to do to square these things? How are you going to reconcile these conflicting impulses to do what's best for me, but also at the same time, right, to fulfill or discharge this duty toward this other person, even if it is not in your best interest? If this world is all that there is, it would seem that at least on occasion, doing the virtuous thing would not really pay off for you. Potentially, you're going to lose your life or something like that, and that's it. End of story, if this world is all that there is. But on the naturalistic understanding of things, this world is all that there is. Sidgwick saw only one possible solution to the dualism, the practical reason. If God existed, if a good, omnibenevolent, loving, sovereign God existed who could somehow coordinate these things and ensure ultimately that at the end of the day, godly virtue perfectly corresponded with complete joy and happiness and fulfillment, then the dualism of the practical reason would disappear. Unfortunately, Sidgwick was not a Christian and he was not a theist. He was an atheist. And this is why he said he thought that the dualism of the practical reason is intractable. It's a problem that the naturalists cannot solve. It didn't dissuade him from being a naturalist, unfortunately, but he thought it was a problem that the naturalists simply could not get around. But you see, the beautiful good news, or at least part of the beautiful good news again, of theism and of Christianity more particularly, is that Sidgwick was wrong on that God thing. There really is a God. And he is a God who will ensure that ultimately it is perfectly and fully rational for you to do the moral thing, the good thing, and to be fully conformed to the image of Christ, to experience the fullness of godly virtue, is to experience the deepest sense of happiness and fulfillment and joy of which we are capable as human beings. Again, once more, profound, utterly profound difference in worldview between what the naturalists have to say about morality and what theists and Christians are able to say about morality. Morality simply fits into a theistic and Christian picture of reality, and it's a very odd fit in a naturalistic world. It's a very odd fit. So what you can do with your naturalistic friends is say, look, if you take morality seriously, so do I. We're on the same page here. Now let's have a discussion about what best explains things like moral facts, moral freedom, moral knowledge, convergence of virtue and happiness, and the like. Do you see? And make the case patiently and lovingly that Christianity can explain these things far better than can the naturalistic worldview. If I had more time, I was going to talk about this, but I'm not going to because I want to leave this open for discussion. I was going to say, in terms of this moral transformation, there is a paradox, and it involves really that we die to ourselves and we allow the life of Christ to come and inhabit us fully. And the fulfillment, the self-realization comes after the death. We are Christians, and there's no way around the death and the resurrection motif, and that goes for morality too. I'd say more about it, but I don't have time. I want to close though with just this general claim that classical theism and Orthodox Christianity, it seems to me, can account for moral facts, moral knowledge, and moral transformation, and this convergence of happiness and holiness simply better than can naturalism. Bertrand Russell was once asked, he's a famous 20th century atheist, what would he say, if he dies and comes before God and God says, why didn't you believe in me? His answer was going to be, not enough evidence. But if the moral argument here works, the evidence for God's existence, it seems to me, is all around us. It is ubiquitous. You simply have to have the eyes to see it. And so I want to encourage you to make it a part of your apologetic repertoire. We have a few minutes left for discussion or anything else. Only 6 minutes or so, I think, if I can see there. But anybody have anything you'd like to discuss or say?
The issue of best explanation.
Yep.
Is that the best way to phrase things? Does it not leave alternative, multi-verse, explanations like physicists like to do, and the underdeterminism theory that you can never have a single theory that supersedes all the others, that there's always at least one alternative that's of equal value.
Yeah. I don't think it's susceptible to that criticism. Craig gives William Lane Craig, the great William Lane Craig, gives a deductive version of the moral argument. And we've had a lot of discussion, he and I, on this very topic. And I've made the case to him that I think an abductive version, an inference to the best explanation, is the better approach. And I've actually got about 6 or 7 reasons why I think this is the case. His version, you have to say, if God doesn't exist, then objective moral values and duties don't exist, end of story. But in order to make that case, you have to assume something other than, well, if God doesn't exist, then nothing exists because God exists necessarily, and so we're talking about the null world or something like that. Now, he's saying something more charitable, which is, well, assume you have a world very much like this. Assume you have a world very much like this, but God doesn't exist. And then you still have to make the case, right, that there can be no such thing as morality of any kind. Well, I'm not sure that's right, because on my view, God does exist necessarily. You couldn't have a world like this without God. And the reason why you can look at a world like this and make some progress making sense of morality is because, if we're right as theists, it's a world, even if we're suspending this belief, it's still a world in which we were created by God in His image for a reason, for a purpose, and it's got His creational stamps all over the place. So there are all kinds of indications of transcendence, And if you're handing all this stuff to your atheist friends saying, now, knock yourself out, take this rich world and come up with a moral theory, I bet you can't come up with anything. they're going to come up with something. They come up with all kinds of things. I come along and say, but nothing that you come up with is as good of an explanation as what we can provide as classical theists, because we have all of those resources that you're talking about and infinitely more. And I think that you can give an abductive case that, though it falls shy of being a deductive case that precludes every other possible alternative, can still be a very compelling case. And so I'm a big fan of an abductive version of the argument. It's a great question. It very much goes to the heart of this disagreement that Craig and I often entertain.
Wallace Matson debate with a believer dealt with the issue of God. He says, why couldn't there be a plurality of gods that each had traits that were equal to the composite of the unique Christian God? And he offered that as a viable alternative on par.
Yeah.
That. And so my point is the issue of best explanation allows a fudge factor.
Yeah. Well, on the assumption, and it's a big assumption, and I wouldn't really grant it, but for purposes of argument, on the assumption that the plurality of gods has the same level of explanatory power as does the one, you could set aside the issue of best explanation at that point and just appeal to the principle of parsimony and say, well, but look, I mean, if two theories explain the facts equally well, but one, all things considered, is far simpler than the other, Occam's razor says, carve out the extraneous hypotheses and go with the simpler explanation. And there's nothing about using an abductive approach that precludes an application of parsimony if it comes to that. So yeah, I don't see good reasons not to go this way. Which is not to say that I don't think the deductive version of the argument is bad. I just think that, there are a variety of ways in which you can package the argument. And the abductive one is most definitely a legitimate one among them. Yeah. That's what I'd say. Yes, sir.
I also just pointed out, they want to respond to it by saying, well, why couldn't there be multiple gods? And if we brought them from naturalism to polytheism, I'm happy. That's progress.
It would be progress. It would be a shift in their worldview away from naturalism. That's true. And today it was largely just sort of theism versus naturalism. Of course, ultimately we want them to become Christians. But yeah, I take your point. That's a good point. Okay. Anybody else? We've got 2 minutes. Yeah.
You were talking about truth. Do naturalists believe in truth?
Yeah.
They just believe in things that are useful.
To believe only in things as being useful, or to characterize truth in terms of things being merely useful, sounds to me like a crass version of a pragmatist theory of truth. Most atheists that I'm aware of still retain pretty firm convictions about something like a correspondence theory of truth, according to which, a proposition is true if what it says corresponds with the way the world actually is. So, in garden variety matters, they certainly would say it's true that it's raining, or it's true that it's not, and so forth, right? But that's not to say that, we shouldn't push them hard on this issue of truth, particularly, say, when they're confronted with what seems to me to be some pretty strong defeaters to their convictions, in light of what their worldview says, and that sort of thing, So yeah, I think that they do, but that's not to say that we can't still engage them on that issue in various respects. Well, it's 9:30. Does anyone have one last one? Well, guys, thanks so much for coming. I really appreciated it and enjoyed it. Have a good night.
Thanks again for listening. I want to remind you that several times a week we have content going up on the site from a wide array of scholars, including poets, theologians, biblical scholars, philosophers. We even have a special series going up every Friday from a Mr. Ichabod to his uncle Apollyon. And if you want to know what that's about, you'll have to check out the website to see. Again, thank you so much for listening. We hope to see you back again next week.